Welcome to On Becoming a Healer. I'm Saul Weiner. If you haven't listened to last month's episode, you may want to do so before hearing this one. We're rerunning these two episodes that were originally aired in 2023 because of the release of a paper in the journal Medical Education last month. The paper is entitled "The Myth That Slow Test Takers Are Worse Students: Implications for Time-Limited Testing." Two of the authors, Morten and Gernsbacher and Christina Peterson, were interviewed for these two episodes. In the episode we ran last month, we hear the overwhelming evidence that creating time pressure for students, even if it's a small percentage of students taking an exam, decreases its validity and equity and serves no meaningful purpose in terms of making the test a more valid measure of what it is intended to measure. In this episode, we hear about the dire consequences of time pressure and setting time limits for many students in terms of undermining their ability to demonstrate what they're capable of and, as a result, either interrupting or having a devastating impact on their career trajectory. All of this is entirely unnecessary. And as a consequence of the high-stakes testers, and I'm talking to you, NBME and MCAT and others, to follow the evidence. When we submitted our manuscript to Medical Education, it was subjected to rigorous peer review, and they concluded that, in fact, we were not overstating the evidence by calling the belief that slow test takers are worse students a myth, and one that harmfully perpetuates the justification for time-limited testing. There was nothing novel or new about what we reported in the manuscript. In fact, psychometricians have known that it's a myth for many decades. The real question is, why do we continue to administer these exams in a way that makes them less valid and less equitable when it would be so easy not to do so? Again, we'll be placing a link to the publication in the show notes. Thank you for listening.
Hello and welcome to On Becoming a Healer. I'm Stefan Kertes with my co-host Saul Weiner. Hi, Saul.
Hey, Stefan.
Today's episode is the third in a three-part series on learning disabilities in medical education. In the last episode, we spoke with a psychologist and an assessment expert about numerous problems with time-limited high-stakes tests. Today, we take those concerns directly to a discussion about the U.S. medical licensing exam, also called the USMLE. And again, we have a very knowledgeable guest who I will introduce in a moment. But before I do that, I'd like to ask Saul a little bit about how we came to this topic. Saul?
Yeah, thank you, Stefan. So as you know, I have a learning disability, so this has been a personal interest of mine, and you interviewed me about that recently. In addition, as a faculty member, I've been on the promotions committee at my own institution for quite a while, and so I've seen a lot of these scenarios play out. I was going to use the word train wrecks, and I think I actually will use the word train wrecks because I've just seen so much struggle and difficulty and challenge for medical students who are coping with learning differences. And so I'm excited to have this third episode where we actually focus specifically on the exams that are administered by the National Board of Medical Examiners, the NBME, the three USMLE exams, particularly the first one, I think, but also the second one. One of the things I got out of Morten's interview, the one that we did with her recently for the last episode, is not only is the failure to give people accommodations a problem for people who need these accommodations because of a disability, but I was struck that she talked about the way in which it contributes to inequities. I recall that she mentioned that it's not just people who have learning disabilities who often need extra time to demonstrate what they know. It's people for whom English may be a second language. It's people who are older than average. It includes people who may feel a sense of stigma, so they never apply in the first place. In particular, veterans, immigrants, first-generation students. There's so many groups that are affected when the testing environment is not structured in a way that is valid and appropriate for them to show what they know. And so I think that taking this from this sort of broader discussion that we had with Morten to a focus on the NBME exams is going to be of particular interest to our listeners.
Yeah, and for word of background here, it's the National Board of Medical Examiners is the group that administers the test, and the test we typically refer to as the USMLE. And these are high-stakes tests, so the source of great anxiety. And if you don't pass them, you don't move forward in medical school or to residency. So let's introduce our guest. Dr. Christina Peterson is an associate professor of biochemistry and molecular biology at the New York Medical College. As assistant dean of academic support programs for nearly a decade, she led a team to support full accessibility and student success. Her scholarly work primarily focuses on inclusive instruction, on course accessibility, and on creating curricula to teach clinicians about persons with disabilities. In 2022, Christina received an award for excellence in scholarly work from the Coalition for Disability Access in Health Science Education. And that year, she also received the AAMC Alpha Omega Alpha Robert J. Glazer Distinguished Teaching Award. She's currently an Alpha Omega Alpha Fellow in Leadership. Hello, Christina.
Hi, Stefan. It's great to be here.
Yeah, thanks so much for being with us. I'm wondering if, just for a start, can you tell us how you got interested in this topic?
I have a lot of history with disabilities, with people that I love and care about. And really, I had a temporary need for accommodations when I was in high school, and that was back in the 90s. And at that time, it wasn't quite clear on how I would get the accommodations that I needed, and there wasn't really a great process in place. So that was my first experience. But as the assistant dean of college academic support programs, I've been in charge of the accommodations piece of medical education within our school. And so I oversee the need for students with disabilities to receive extra time as one example of a type of accommodation. There are other types of accommodations, of course. And so I've seen, much like what Saul was describing, being on the promotions committee, I've seen many of these students who do not receive the appropriate accommodations from the USMLE, unfortunately, have dire consequences as a result downstream. And so, it's something that is near and dear to my heart. And I recognize that there was a lack of scholarly work being done in this, and just thought this was something that needed to be done. And so I thought, why not me? I seemed to be in a position where I could gather some data from different colleagues across the nation. And so I was grateful to the team that worked with me, and we published this paper that I think alerted you to my interest in this topic. So I'm very excited to have an opportunity to talk about it, because I do think this is an issue that absolutely needs more time for others to consider, so that perhaps change can be affected.
So, yes, in fact, you published a paper in the journal PLOS One called The Impact of USMLE Step 1 Accommodation Denial on U.S. Medical Schools, a national survey. And before I ask you further about this, I want to make clear something which it took me a while to absorb. What we're discussing here are situations where a medical school has made some form of assessment that a student does require a disability accommodation, extra time on a test, or something else. The medical school's already agreed that is needed, and the primary agency that administers tests disagrees with the medical schools. Is that right?
That's correct. So the nature of our study was to identify professionals within each institution that's LCME accredited that is in a position to know who the students are who receive accommodations in the institution, and then within that pool of students, for them to tell us whether they did receive accommodations from the USMLE and what some of those downstream outcomes were.
Wow. Yeah. So I think that's the key thing is the school's already, well, we'll go around this a few times, but a school's agreed. A bona fide certified medical school has agreed a student needs an accommodation, but we have an external party that's extremely authoritative that says, nah, not really. That raises big flags of concern for me. But let's go to your study in detail. I wonder if you could share with us, it sounds like it was a survey of the schools themselves, but it included questions about students. Tell us how it worked, how you did your survey.
Yeah, that's correct. So we sent a survey of 10 questions out to all the LCME accredited institutions across the nation. We sent them to the student affairs deans as well as the disability resource professionals, and we asked that they collaborate to answer the questions, because oftentimes, there are differences in the ways that institutions are structured, so we wanted both parties to be included. We received 276 responses, and then of those, 52% of the students were denied accommodations by the NBME for step 1. So that's of great concern that 52% of the students within our survey responses did not receive accommodations from the NBME when they did receive accommodations at their medical school.
Wow. And then what was the impact of that on those students?
So of the students that were denied, 76% of them actually decided or opted to take the exam unaccommodated, meaning they did not appeal their decision and ultimately ended up taking the exam. And then of those students who took the exam without accommodations, we actually saw that 32% of them failed the exam. And I just want to give you a little bit of a frame of reference for that number, because in that very same academic year, 2018 to 2019, what we saw nationally was a 4 to 5% failure rate. So you can see that it's considerably higher than that among this particular pool of students.
I can imagine some people listening to this and saying, well, maybe those medical schools just tell the students, hey, you can apply if you want. We'll pass along your application. We don't know if you're going to get this. We don't even know if you really deserve it. And I really want to understand, how confident are you, let's put it this way, that the schools agreed that the students required accommodation?
So schools in general go through, and I can't speak for every school and every school's procedure, but the standard or best practices is supposed to be that all schools have a procedure through which students must apply, and it's a pretty robust procedure where they are required to submit supplemental documentation from appropriate clinicians, depending on the diagnosis. Oftentimes, they may even require more than one clinician to support the diagnosis. So again, depending on what the disability is, there will at least be some clinical documentation that's required, if not more than one clinician actually weighing in on the need for this particular student to get accommodations.
When a student applies for accommodation from the National Board of Medical Examiners for that USMLE exam, does the dean or an official at the school have to somehow facilitate or sign off?
So it's not absolutely mandatory that a official at the school must sign off. However, within the application itself, there is a form that the students are asked to have the institution fill out, which certifies that they actually receive accommodations from the school. In other words, right. So we know usually, unless a student sort of goes rogue and turns in their application without us knowing, which can happen, I would say, we try and communicate with our students and let them know we really want to support them and we would like to submit that form on their behalf. And in that form, it gives us an opportunity to talk about how we came to the decision, sort of the rationale behind why we believe this student requires the accommodations that they've been afforded at our institution. And then the other thing that we do at our institution and other schools do, but not all, is we actually invite students, if they would like, to submit drafts of their personal statement, because of course we see these every year. And so we know kind of what the language is that most helps support their need for accommodations. And we see the feedback on the denials every year. And so we try and help advise our students as to how to best put their personal statement into the right framework that will help them advocate for themselves. We also look at their clinical documentation and write a whole cover letter that really incorporates the various different comments by the clinicians, the hopefully quantitative data. So, there are often evaluations like neuropsychological evaluations that actually have psychometric tests, and we try to quote what some of the things are that most support the need for the student to have the actual accommodation they're requesting. So that would be the best practice within kind of the disability resource professional world, would be to actually partner with the student on putting together that application and submit a letter that advocates for the students. I will say not all schools do that, but minimally they are supposed to submit the certification of prior accommodations, which again, every institution therefore should know who of their students are applying for STEP accommodations.
So you've been part of this process at times in terms of applying for accommodation. And that suggests to me you've probably seen the denials from the National Board of Medical Examiners. Is that right?
Yes, I've seen many denials, unfortunately, in my tenure here at New York Medical College over 9 years.
So when again, just to emphasize, a medical school, which is a credentialed institution with credentialed officials, agrees or usually agrees and supports an application for accommodation under federal law. National Board of Medical Examiners, maybe 50%, in some studies up to 75% of the time, says, we disagree, we're not going to accommodate. Have you seen an explanation of some of these denials from the National Board without breaking any confidentiality? What are the kinds of things they say?
So oftentimes one of the things that they'll come back and say is that in their estimation, this person is not disabled on the standard of the average person, meaning because our students are, as I'm sure you all know, very, very smart students, and they are really at the top of kind of their percentiles, usually in terms of IQ and other items that are measurable. But because the USMLE applies a standard of you must be disabled compared to the average population of your peers, that's what they often come back with, is that because this person is essentially, I'm going to maybe editorialize just a bit, but essentially oftentimes it also includes the reference to strong academics and strong, the sort of this person made it this far kind of argument, where if they made it through the MCAT and they managed to score XYZ on the MCAT, then how are you saying that now this student requires accommodations?
Wow. Okay. So they're saying, it's nice that you've applied for the accommodation, but you made it into medical school, so you can't possibly need an accommodation. That sounds like the argument here, which is your very success is the reason we will not be agreeing with your school officials, or I would say honoring law. Interesting.
So yeah, that's often the argument that comes back. And of course, those of us that disagree with that, which there are many of us, really feel, every student has their own potential. And some of our students have an incredible amount of potential, and scoring, on the 70th percentile versus scoring on the 90th percentile, if they can score that high as a result of having accommodations that they require in order to mitigate their disability-related barriers, then we want them to have that opportunity. The point is not for them to just pass the test. The point is for them to be able to perform to the best of their ability.
And so there is a downstream consequence potentially of failing the test, which I heard occurred for 32% of the applicants in your study, but there's also a consequence potentially for a lower level of performance, at least on part 2 and part 3. Is that right?
Right. So now that step 1 is pass-fail, I suppose, students do not receive a sort of a percentile score. They either get a pass or a fail, and that's relatively recently changed. However, of course, that means there's even more of a focus on step 2 CK and then later on step 3. But step 2 CK, of course, now becomes really important in determining residency placement. And having that later in the career of a person also, we don't know how that's necessarily going to impact students with disabilities. We do believe, and we talked about this in our paper in the discussion, that actually could work against persons with disabilities, in part because there's more pressure on them. They have now gotten to their third year, and there's a lot more financial impact if they don't pass. They also potentially might be having to go through this really time-intensive process of applying for these accommodations during their clinical clerkships. And how will that impact their performance in clinic, as well as what might it discourage them from actually participating in the application process because they don't feel they have the time to put in that's necessary in order to go through the process.
Yeah, I think not all our listeners may know this, but the third year of medical school, you're often so busy that accumulating large sets of documents to prove anything outside of your regular daily work is extremely tough. You did report in your paper on the amount of time spent by the offices you surveyed in assisting each student. Can you give us a summary of what you found about the types of assistance dean's offices are investing each time they agree that a student should apply?
Okay, so in terms of institutional resources, what we received responses from our student affairs officials and also our disabilities resource professionals, and we found that 69% of them did report that they supported only up to $1,000 in financial support for academic needs. And then we had 4% of institutions on the other end of the spectrum where they produced or they provided more than $15,000 in support. So obviously there's a big difference there, and we had numbers all in between within the other areas. So between 0 and 15,000, of course, the rest of the schools fell in place there. In terms of financial support for student living expenses and insurance, because remember, when a student potentially has to go on a leave of absence or is delayed into entry into the next year because they're taking the exam late or because they're waiting on a decision, they end up often going on leave of absence. When they go on leave of absence, often they don't have health insurance unless they happen to be under their parents' insurance. So some schools actually do support that expense. And so that's actually where we saw 7% of schools actually provided more than $15,000 to help support some of those expenses, whereas most schools, 74%, again, were on the 0 to 1,000 kind of range. So we don't see a lot of financial support that was captured by our survey questions being provided to students for either academic needs or for kind of student living expenses or insurance expenses. However, we also sort of postulate based on some of the fill in the blank answers that we received, some of the more qualitative responses, that there were probably some resources that may not have been captured in those numbers. And that includes things like tutoring services and, some of the embedded academic support programs that are already accounted for. So they may not be thinking of them as additional expenses, but rather the number of hours that are spent potentially by somebody helping to support in study strategies and even putting together a potential appeal, for example. And then the other thing we didn't capture in the number of hours here was this idea of how much time it took to actually put the application itself together. The way that we posed our questions really involved after the denial. So we were really interested in seeing the downstream effects of the denial. And what we recognized as we received our answers is that what we did not capture was how much time preemptively institutions and students are putting in to actually preparing their application long before they receive the denial.
Again, in listening to this, I'm aware that we have a federal law that requires accommodation for disability, and that includes disabilities that might influence test performance. And some of our listeners will know that in a prior episode, we entertained the argument that actually extra time should just be available for everybody. It shouldn't actually require proving you need it because it's a less valid test when it's time limited. Nonetheless, given the things as they stand, federal law requires accommodation. Medical schools have determined accommodation is a valid and appropriate thing to offer. This institution, the National Board of Medical Examiners, simply says we disagree with an extremely large number of cases. Has the National Board of Medical Examiners faced any liability or challenge under the Americans with Disability Act because of its stance against providing accommodation for students who have documented disabilities?
So there have been students who have sued the NBME, and there have been decisions kind of on both sides. Again, because disability is a case-by-case basis, what ends up happening, of course, is a number of things. Number one, your name is usually associated, although there's a way you can do it that your name isn't associated with the actual case on the docket. But mostly, students will be associated with the case. And then, of course, all of their private information is now all of a sudden part of a record that anyone can get a hold of, where they're talking about the details of their disability and the details of their medical documentation, right? Which most of us don't really want to be made public. But in order for them to do this, right, if they're going to sue, then all of a sudden they have to provide the justification, which of course comes back to medical documentation. So all of this becomes part of the public record. So this is a big risk for these students. And then
for the individual.
For the individual, absolutely. It's a big risk for the individual student. It's also a huge expense. And also, as Saul pointed out earlier, just the amount of time it takes, right? I mean, there is a student there was a settlement, and as a result, the student did receive the accommodations that she needed, but it took several years. So then we have, right, yeah, at least 3 years between when she finished the curriculum and when she was allowed to then take the exam with the appropriate accommodations. And of course, then she's 3 more years out from the curriculum and has to go back and really relearn everything and try and get everything fresh again, to the point where she can perform to her best ability. So, that's a huge time investment. It's also the power disparity, as was also mentioned, between the student, who they know as they hope future medical professional, they're going to be under the jurisdiction of the NBME for their entire career. So to go up against the very medical licensing board that is responsible for making sure that you have a career for the next, 40, 50 years, whatever the number is for each individual, maybe that's an overestimate, but it's pretty daunting to do that.
Yeah. One of the sections of your paper that really struck me was where you wrote, over half of respondents discussed the emotional toll on students. Terms such as fear, anger, devastation, anguish, demoralizing, traumatizing, suffering, frustration, stressful, and distressful were used to characterize this impact. Respondents attributed these terms to the challenges of putting together an application, which required a high degree of vulnerability, and the impact of forging ahead without accommodation or an appeal. And I think that the general public could respond to something like this and say, oh, well, at least we're glad that the NBME is, quote, upholding standards. Like that might be a response that you could get from the general public. And the NBME could say, well, we are responsible to the public for who becomes a physician, so we have to have these, quote unquote, high standards. That might be the argument they would make. However, as we discussed extensively in the prior episode, that's not true. That these accommodations, which are mandated by federal law, are designed to level the playing field. They're designed to allow learners to demonstrate what they actually know and can do. And so when you deny these accommodations, all you're doing is distorting your own data. You're no longer getting an accurate measure of what your learners are capable of. And so I think that the question we have to ask is, how do we fix this problem? And I think one of the issues that Christina and you were just discussing is that the legal system isn't really working here because the power dynamic is so unequal. It's so asymmetric. On the one hand, you have the NBME, which is all powerful and basically has enormous influence over the lives of these future physicians. And on the other hand, you have these medical students who are essentially not connected to each other, right? They're each living in their own world. They're each struggling. It's not like they can easily they don't work all in the same factory. They can't create a class action suit. They're all doing it at different times, right? And for each of them, they're having to make agonizing personal decisions under enormous pressure. And so the problem just persists. And I think that's why this is such an important issue for us all to be discussing. One thing that also struck me is that you had to do this survey in the first place. I mean, ordinarily, why couldn't you just go to the NBME and say, hey, guys, can you just tell us how often do you deny? How often, why is there no transparency? I mean, it's sort of interesting that that even there, they're apparently not willing to show their cards. I'm assuming before you guys embarked on this extensive research project, presumably you must have occurred to you that you weren't going to get this from the NBME by just asking them. Do you want to actually comment on that, Christina?
Well, so I will just say, as especially through some of the advocacy work that I've been doing with the Coalition for Disability Access and Health Science Education, we were in touch with the NBME. We've reached out to them on several occasions through letters expressing concern. Particularly at the time of when COVID was occurring, we reached out to them. And so that was around the same time as we were thinking about doing this study. If you notice, the time frame of our survey was during COVID, so in 2020. And we had reached out to them regarding our concern about the accommodation process being particularly delayed or especially delayed during COVID, and didn't really receive any response. They never acknowledged receiving our letter. It was signed by a number of professionals in the field that are concerned and are part of accredited medical schools. And so it was disappointing at best. And I know that there have been other letters prior to my tenure in the leadership of that particular organization that had also not been met with any response. And we were not confident that there would be cooperation there. I know that there have been other leaders that have been having discussions. And again, there are some groups that are much more open to discussions, like the AAMC has been very open to discussions, the AMA has been very open to discussions. We have not had that same kind of response from the NBME at this point, unfortunately.
It's really interesting. So you have at least some major professional organizations. One you just named is the American Association of Medical Colleges, which has a lot of influence over the aspirations, goals, and plans for medical schools. They are interested in whether students have a fair shot at getting through a national board exam. And yet the entity of the National Board of Medical Examiners, which presumably has some overlapping membership, I wouldn't be shocked if there were people who knew each other between one and the other, is apparently not behaving as if they're that interested in assuring adequate accommodation. I'm editorializing a bit here, but if you have a 50 or 75% denial rate, it sounds like that's not a high priority.
Yeah, I can't speak to the NBME's perspective on that, but I can say, just looking at the literature, there are many stakeholders and many leaders of organizations, including the AAMC and the AMA, who've come out in support of wanting to enhance access and wanting to enhance inclusion of students with disabilities. In terms of their specific opinions on the NBME's procedures, I can't comment on that in terms of the AAMC or the AMA, but I will say that they're very interested in trying to make the system more inclusive. And so I think by extension, I think this is part of the system that needs to be discussed.
Yeah. Saul, do you have other reflections from your work in medical education? Sort of, what is the type of disability that would be debated? We're often talking about things like your case from 2 episodes ago, which is a learning disability where you needed some extra time to do the test, and yet you yourself rose to be the Senior Associate Dean for Medical Education. It's not like you were incompetent in medicine as a result of being allowed to get that. Are there other types of disability we should be thinking about?
Well, again, I'm not a disability expert. And so I can't talk the way, say, a psychometrician could or a psychologist. I did emphasize when you talked to me about my own personal story that I was very privileged. I came from a background where I had a paper trail of a learning disability going all the way back to second grade. And so I kind of I was almost like a perfect test case. And so I actually did get accommodation from the NBME. But again, that was because of my very privileged situation. And I think that gets to the whole issue of equity that we talked about, that so many medical students don't come to medical school with those advantages. And then they end up in this truly catch-22 situation where they're told, well, the very fact that you've been successful means that you must not have a disability. I'm laughing because it kind of reminds me of the Salem witch trials, right? Like, if you drown, then you probably weren't a witch. It's absurd. And it's also unfair. When we combine this discussion with the one we had with Morton, what Morton was saying is, why not just give everybody extra time if they ask for it? Why have a time-limited test in the first place? I mean, not endless amounts of time, but just take away the time pressure. The test will not only become fair for people with disabilities, but it'll be fair for all kinds of people who would benefit who may not apply for disabilities for all the reasons that she mentioned, including their fear of stigma, the fact that they are not aware that they have that option or that they can't afford it. Just take away the whole problem in the first place, and you fixed it. So I think what's tragic about this situation is the fix to the most common request, which is extra time, is so simple. Just get rid of
just give it.
Yeah, just say, fine, everybody can have an extra hour or whatever, 2 hours, whatever you want to make it, just double time and a half, something that just essentially eliminates the time pressure. And as Morton talked about in the last episode, time-limited testing was never actually even intended, if you go back historically, to be part of the validation process. There are historical reasons why time limits were established, and they actually had nothing to do with validation. And again, for those who are interested, she discusses that in her great
prior episode.
Yeah.
The key is, it's less. It appears that the time-limited testing for complex issues is actually less valid, even for types of work where potentially you need to make decisions on the fly, such as being a jet pilot. The time limit actually reduces the overall validity of the test. So we have this giant bureaucracy to assess whether people should get time accommodation when the time limit itself is reducing the validity of the test we are talking about, not enhancing it.
Yeah, and again, one of the fascinating experiments that Morton talked about, because she said, whenever I come across skeptical colleagues, I say to them, next time you teach a large class and administer a test, ask your proctor, if it's not yourself, to take note of when each person gets up and turns in and leaves and finishes the exam, and then correlate that with their score on the exam, and you'll see there's no correlation whatsoever. And I think that, her point was that this has been studied over and over again. And what was fascinating about Morton's discussions, he said, this isn't new knowledge. He said, this has actually been known for 100 years. And one of the most fascinating things she talked about was that this notion that, slow means dumb and fast means smart is just this deeply entrenched misunderstanding of how people perform under different circumstances. Fascinating, particularly when she talked about this pejorative term, retarded, which she said is actually not even accurate. So I think that the importance of this discussion with Christina becomes amplified when we combine it with our earlier discussion about solutions to this problem. And I think that's what makes this such a meaningful topic. And I hope if the NBME folks are out there that they're listening.
One of the things that I really appreciated that you brought up was the idea of intersectional identities and how this issue really particularly impacts people that do not have as much privilege. And so their parents didn't know to keep all the documentation since they were in kindergarten. Their parents didn't know that getting a neuropsych eval was an option. Or we've had students who have immigrated from countries where their education system is vastly different and the resources available to them were much, much less. And yet they still have required that they show documentation back to their elementary school years. And there have been students who've had, unfortunately, experienced fires in their homes and their parents haven't been able to produce them. I mean, these are all just different issues going back to socioeconomic and educational backgrounds and all kinds of disparities that come into play. And they're all intersecting when there is also a disability diagnosis that entitles someone under the law to receive accommodations in order for them to be able to fully perform to their best ability. And yet, because of the requirements that far exceed what really needs to be demonstrated in order to show that one needs an accommodation, it just seems they're denying folks, and they're also taking a long period of time to render those decisions. And so students are waiting and waiting and waiting for their decision. They finally maybe get their decision, and then they don't have time to appeal without actually taking additional time out from their medical education, which, as you know, also has downstream effects and potentially could rule them out as a top candidate for a residency that they might like to apply for.
Yeah, you've seen some of the consequences, I would imagine, of these situations where students apply and are not accommodated. Yeah, if you can reflect a little more on what you have seen students and their families experience, I'd be appreciative.
I mean, it's gut-wrenching is really the only way I can describe it. And again, with Saul describing some of the procedures in the promotions committees, I mean, I've sat on those, but of course I don't divulge the conversations that are had, but they are not pleasant. They're not pleasant. And so, but in terms of the student experience, it's I think it was described in the qualitative analysis a little bit that, it's hard enough for these students to have to essentially put their whole heart on a page in a personal statement, or a few pages in a personal statement, describing some of their biggest challenges of their lives and some of the most probably personal things that they have had happen to them and the barriers they've experienced. And they're really supposed to focus on the things that have not gone well for them, so to speak, academically, right? Things that have been difficult for them, and focusing on all those barriers. It's the absolute opposite of what they had to do for a personal statement and being admitted to medical school. So having to try and get students to write something like that is already hard on them, and then emotionally, and then they have to wait. And I will tell you, it used to be 60 days that they would render the decision, and sometime around 2019, without really telling us exactly when it happened, I noticed there was a difference, and now all of a sudden they're 60 business days, which of course made it so that now it's really, increased the amount of time students must wait by a considerable amount. So it's at least 3 months has really been our experience between when a student submits and a student receives the decision. And also they usually about a week after they receive a document saying if they want more documentation. So they may even have a further delay there. And then if they get a decision back that it's a denial, which often happens, unfortunately, then they have to decide, am I going to appeal? Because in order to appeal, you really have to answer what their argument is, which again often requires more documentation, which requires going to see another clinician, which you can't get into immediately. and further exploration of the diagnosis or explanation of the diagnosis by the particular folks that have already weighed in. So again, that's more time, that's more effort, that's more money. It depends on who your clinician is. Are they willing to write me another letter, or do I need to now pay them to do that? So there's potentially a financial implication, definitely a time implication for these students that are already really very busy trying to just keep their heads above water academically and just with all the responsibilities they have as students.
I really worry that the medical profession itself is deprived of talent, of potentially great contributors, often great contributors who come from less privileged backgrounds than Saul's, who would be superb doctors, who could make a contribution either scientifically or clinically or in terms of management and leadership. And because of some challenge with a time-limited multiple choice test, which we're not even sure is valid, inability to overcome that hurdle puts those people by the wayside, and we don't get the benefit of their leadership and their guidance and their care 20 years down the line. So I feel like it's a little bit of a loss for the profession and a loss for the communities we live in.
I wholeheartedly agree. I would say that the disability community, and I'm speaking very, very broadly, right? There are lots of disabilities that are included within this definition, but they really bring a nuanced perspective from their own experiences, and frankly, often are very hard workers. I mean, many of them have had to learn how to adapt some of their strategies and how they can best work and how they can be most efficient.
Seems like a pretty glaring gap between what the medical schools regard as ethical and appropriate and what the National Board of Medical Examiners regard as ethical and appropriate, and also potentially a gap between what federal law requires and what is being done. And rather than try to resolve this through some sort of massive lawsuit initiated by the Department of Justice, I'd like to believe in a world in which people of goodwill get together and discuss the problem and try to figure out whether it can be addressed. Presumably there are people within the National Board of Medical Examiners who do not begin their day thinking, how can I screw over the most people possible, but actually begin their day thinking, how do I help make for a better society? Is there any obvious venue or opportunity for dialogue?
I'm open to it.
Saul, do you have any reflections on trying to establish dialogue when there's conflict? I certainly have done this. I've done some protesting of my own in the world and wound up seeking out conversations with the very people.
I think, as we know from the history of disability activism, that it is in fact activism. It requires people speaking up, demanding justice, demanding equity. That has always been the way in which change happens, and ultimately finding ways to bring people to the table. I think just having a conversation like this and sharing it with the medical education community, it's a very small part of that conversation. I think that the National Board of Medical Examiners should be a shining example of evidence-based decision-making and caring, right? I mean, it represents a good deal of, it's a gatekeeper to the profession. And I think what we're saying here is that you can fix this. And if you fix this, you will be more evidence-based in terms of carrying out your role as a gatekeeper, and you will be more caring. And so it's a win-win.
It's been interesting since that paper got published. I've received emails from many students who read the paper and resonated with the feeling of what we described, the frustration, the emotional turmoil that it caused for them. And so there are actually two groups of students, one from Rowan. Emily Serrata is leading a study on the effect of USMLE accommodations process on students with type 1 diabetes. So that's a national study. And then Sanjeev Her and Willow Pastard from Drexel are also leading a study looking at the effect on students with ADHD specifically. So they approached me and asked, hey, could we do something that was specific to, their sort of experiences? And so we're doing that. And as long as this disparity still exists, I feel like collecting data, learning from the data, and reporting the data is kind of where we are in terms of what I feel, at least me within my role, what I can do and what I can do to help support students. I'll continue to support students. I have a number who contact me about looking at their applications and trying to strengthen them, and I do try to do that as well. But man, the process definitely needs to be, I think, looked at. And if anything else, it absolutely should be streamlined. And some of the low-hanging fruit of things that could be altered to make it better for students in terms of just wellness would be very much appreciated on our end of seeing these students that are going through what they are going through in the way that the process is currently. It's really devastating.
I just want to say thank you so much, Christina, for your time with us on this podcast. Saul, any final words?
No, I also want to thank you, Christina. I have to say, I think it's particularly cool that you're actually a biochemistry professor, because biochemistry was one of the terrifying classes that I remember from medical school, and so to have somebody who's a biochemistry professor being an advocate for student success, I think is particularly important and great. So thank you.
Well, thank you. And I do try and go into my biochemistry classes with some humor. And, so I'm an unusual, perhaps, biochemistry professor, but I love it. And I really care about my students succeeding. So thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate what you're doing to try and illuminate this topic.
You bet.
Thank you.
Take care, and thank you.
We hope you've enjoyed this latest episode of On Becoming a Healer. If you have and you haven't already subscribed, please consider doing so now. Also, please rate us on the Apple Podcast app, as it will help others find us. And if you have a few moments, leave a review. In addition, if you'd like to make a comment about this episode, we'd love to hear from you. There are a couple ways to do that. If you're using the Apple Podcast app, then just open the episode website link and enter your comment there. Or you can directly go to the website contextualizingcare.org, select the podcast tab, and then scroll down and click on the episode. There you'll find the same comment box. Finally, you can always reach us at onbecomingahealer@gmail.com.